Rain doesn't wash away sins. It just makes the pavement slick enough for a body to slide into the gutter. She was trash to them. A discarded problem gasping a final breath in a nameless alley. Then headlights cut through the downpour. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, stopped inches from her face. He wasn't a hero. Roman Hale was the monster parents warned their children about. But that night, the city's worst nightmare became the only thing keeping her alive. Concrete met bone. A dull, sickening thud echoed off the brick walls of the alley. Sadie didn't scream. She had lost the air required for that 3 kicks ago. She just curled tighter into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest, throwing her arms over her head to protect the fragile casing of her skull. "Tell your brother," a voice sneered from above her. The words were distorted by the torrential rain, but the malice cut through the noise perfectly. "He's got 48 hours, or next time I don't stop at the ribs." Another kick. This one caught her shoulder. The joint popped loudly. Sadie bit completely through her bottom lip. A warm, metallic taste flooded her mouth, thick and sickeningly sweet against the freezing rainwater washing over her face. Footsteps retreated. A heavy boot splashed through a deep puddle, kicking a discarded takeout container out of the way. The metal door at the end of the alley slammed shut. The lock engaged with a heavy, final clank. Then there was only the rain. It was a relentless, freezing gray sheet that battered the city of Oakhaven. It washed the grime from the neon signs above, casting harsh, flickering red and blue shadows across the garbage bags surrounding her. Sadie lay on her side, her cheek pressed flat against the wet, jagged asphalt. The cold was sinking into her clothes, past her skin, settling deep into her marrow. She tried to inhale, but a sharp, stabbing agony radiated from her left side. Broken ribs, at least 2. She tried to open her right eye, but it was already swelling shut, heavy with fluid and torn tissue. Through the slits of her left eye, she watched a rat scurry along the edge of a dumpster, unbothered by the dying woman a few feet away. It was pathetic, really. Sadie wasn't a criminal. She waited tables at a diner that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and old grease. She paid her rent. She kept her head down. But her brother Ben did not. Ben liked cards. He liked dice. And most of all, he liked borrowing money from men who wore cheap suits and carried heavy brass knuckles. Tommy was one of those men. When Ben skipped town, Tommy came looking for the next best thing. The cold was making her sleepy. That was a bad sign. Hypothermia was setting in, slowing her racing heart, numbing the sharpest edges of her pain. The alley grew darker, the neon lights bleeding together into a fuzzy, comforting blur. "Just close your eyes," a voice whispered in her head. "Just for a minute." She let her eyes drift shut. The vibration of a subway train rumbling beneath the street offered a strange, rocking comfort. Then, a different vibration cut through the ground. Smoother, heavier. A low, mechanical purr reverberated off the alley walls. A pair of intensely bright LED headlights swept across the garbage, casting long, monstrous shadows over the brickwork. The light hit Sadie's face, forcing her to wince and turn her head. The vehicle was massive, a sleek armored SUV that had no business idling in a slum like this. The engine cut. 4 heavy doors opened and closed in rapid succession. "Check the perimeter," a deep, calm voice ordered. Footsteps. Not the chaotic, angry stomping of Tommy and his thugs. These were measured, deliberate. The sound of expensive leather soles gripping the wet pavement. Sadie tried to push herself up, driven by a sudden, primal spike of adrenaline. If Tommy had come back to finish the job, her arm gave out. She collapsed back onto the asphalt with a wet slap, coughing violently. Each cough sent stars exploding across her vision. The footsteps stopped right in front of her face. Sadie forced her good eye open. She saw a pair of black, impeccably polished Oxford shoes. The water seemed to bead up and roll right off the leather. Above the shoes, charcoal gray trousers, perfectly tailored to a tall frame. A long black cashmere overcoat hung open, revealing a 3-piece suit that cost more than Sadie would make in a lifetime of wiping down diner tables. She dragged her gaze higher. The man looking down at her didn't have a face full of pity. He didn't look horrified by the pulped, ruined state of her features. He looked at her the way a jeweler inspects a flaw in a diamond, impersonal, calculating, and mildly irritated. He had sharp, aristocratic features, a strong jaw lightly dusted with dark stubble, and eyes that were entirely unreadable in the harsh glare of the headlights. Roman Hale. Sadie didn't know him personally, but she knew his face. Everyone in the city knew his face. You saw it on the evening news, right before the anchor talked about a mysterious warehouse fire, or a sudden, violent change in union leadership. He was the ghost that haunted the city's corrupt machinery, a mafia boss who operated with corporate precision. I'm dead, Sadie thought, the realization settling over her like a heavy blanket. Tommy didn't kill me. The devil did. Roman crouched down. The fabric of his trousers pulled tight over his knees. But he didn't seem to care that the hem of his coat was brushing against the filthy, rain-slicked pavement. He reached out a gloved hand and gently, almost clinically, tilted her chin up. His thumb brushed against the swelling on her cheekbone. Sadie flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth. "Tommy Sullivan does sloppy work," Roman murmured. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like gravel dragging over glass. Sadie tried to speak, to tell him to go to hell, but all that came out was a wet, ragged wheeze. Roman dropped his hand. He stood up slowly, looking back over his shoulder at a mountain of a man standing by the SUV. "Carter." "Yes, Mr. Hale?" The giant stepped forward, rain bouncing off his bald head. "Put her in the car." Carter hesitated, glancing at the blood and grime soaking Sadie's clothes. "Sir, the interior—" Roman didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence that followed Carter's objection was heavier than the storm. "I said, put her in the car." Carter didn't argue further. He stepped around Roman and reached down. Sadie braced for the agony, but Carter moved with surprising efficiency. He scooped her up under her arms and knees, lifting her off the ground as easily as if she were a wet towel. The sudden shift in gravity made Sadie's head spin violently. The world tilted, the neon light streaking across her vision. She felt the soft, buttery leather of the SUV's back seat against her cheek, a jarring contrast to the concrete she had just been scraping against. The door slammed shut, sealing her in a silent, climate-controlled bubble. The last thing she heard before the darkness completely swallowed her was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the rain against the armored glass. The first sensation was the smell, sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of the damp rot of the alley. It smelled like rubbing alcohol and expensive laundry detergent. Sadie tried to swallow, but her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. She slowly blinked her left eye open. The right one was still glued shut with dried fluids and swelling. She wasn't dead. The pain was too specific for hell. She was lying in a bed that felt obscenely soft. The sheets were heavy linen, crisp and cool against her bruised skin. She stared up at a ceiling painted a pristine, matte white. A modern, geometric chandelier hung in the center, casting a warm, dim light across the room. She tried to sit up. Her body immediately vetoed the idea. Fire shot through her ribs, and her shoulders screamed in protest. She let out a sharp gasp, collapsing back into the pillows. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the voice came from the corner of the room. Sadie jerked her head to the side, fighting through a wave of nausea. A woman in a neat gray cardigan was sitting in a leather armchair, a clipboard resting on her lap. She looked to be in her late 50s, with tired eyes and graying hair pulled into a tight bun. "Who are you?" Sadie croaked. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, hollow and frail. "Dr. Evans," the woman replied, setting the clipboard down and standing up. She walked over to the bed, shining a small penlight into Sadie's good eye. "You have 3 fractured ribs, a dislocated right shoulder, which I've popped back into place and immobilized, severe contusions across your torso and face, mild hypothermia, and a concussion. You need to stay perfectly still." Sadie swatted the light away weakly. "Where am I?" "You're in a guest room." "Whose?" The door to the bedroom clicked open before Dr. Evans could answer. The heavy oak swung inward, silently. Roman Hale walked in. He had shed the overcoat, but he was still wearing the charcoal suit. Up close, in the light, Sadie could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He didn't look like a mob boss arriving to gloat. He looked like a CEO who had just sat through a 12-hour board meeting and was entirely out of patience. He walked to the foot of the bed and stood there, his hands resting in his pockets. He stared at her, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. Dr. Evans stepped back, deferring to him instantly. "She woke up a minute ago. Vitals are stabilizing, but she needs rest and pain management." "Leave us," Roman said. It wasn't a request. Dr. Evans nodded once, gathered her medical bag, and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sadie felt her heart hammering against her fractured ribs. She pulled the thick duvet up slightly, suddenly hyper-aware that beneath it, she was only wearing a thin cotton hospital gown. "You ruined a custom leather seat," Roman said flatly. Sadie stared at him. Of all the things she expected the head of the Hale Syndicate to say to her, a complaint about upholstery was not on the list. "Send me the bill," she rasped, trying to sound defiant. It came out sounding pathetic. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in Roman's jaw. "You couldn't afford the stitching, Sadie." Her breath hitched. "You know my name. I know everything that happens in the Narrows. I know your brother Ben racked up $40,000 in gambling debts. I know he ran to Chicago on a bus 3 days ago. And I know Tommy Sullivan decided to make an example out of you because he couldn't find him." Roman pulled a silver cigarette case from his inner pocket, snapped it open, and extracted a cigarette. He didn't light it. He just rolled it between his fingers. "So what?" Sadie said, her grip tightening on the duvet. "You saved me out of the goodness of your heart? You run a charity now?" Roman let out a short, humorless exhale. "I don't believe in charity. I believe in leverage. And Tommy Sullivan is an irritating insect who has been encroaching on my territory. He answers to a man I am currently dismantling." "I don't care about your gang wars," Sadie spat. The effort made her ribs ache violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the pain to pass. "If you want me to testify against him or something, you saved the wrong girl. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. I don't use the police, Sadie. I don't need your testimony." Roman stepped around the foot of the bed, moving closer. He stopped beside the nightstand, looking down at her battered face. "I need you to stay here, quietly, until I say otherwise." Sadie opened her good eye. "Am I a prisoner?" "You're a guest who requires medical supervision." "That sounds like a prisoner with a nicer bed." Roman finally put the unlit cigarette back in his case and snapped it shut with a sharp clack. "If you want to leave, the door is unlocked. You have a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a brother who left you to be beaten to death. Tommy Sullivan thinks you're rotting in an alley. If you walk out that door, you have to go back to the diner, back to your apartment. When Tommy finds out you're alive, he will finish the job. This time, I won't send a car." He laid the facts out cold and bare on the table. He wasn't threatening her. He was simply explaining the mathematics of her survival. Sadie hated him for it. She hated how calm he was, how completely he controlled the board. But more than that, she hated that he was right. She had nowhere to go, no money, no protection. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you're just taking down Tommy's boss, why bother picking me up from the gutter?" Roman looked at her for a long time. His dark eyes flicked over the bruises on her neck, the split in her lip. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression. A crack in the corporate armor, revealing a glimpse of the absolute violence underneath. "Because," Roman said quietly, "I dislike men who make a mess and lack the competence to clean it up." He turned and walked toward the door. "Get some sleep. Dr. Evans will bring you food in the morning." He opened the door and stepped out, the heavy oak closing behind him, locking Sadie in a luxurious, terrifying new reality. Time in the Hale estate moved differently. It wasn't measured in shifts at the diner or the frantic countdown to rent day. It was measured in the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, the scheduled visits from Dr. Evans, and the dull, pulsing ache in Sadie's chest. For the first 4 days, she didn't leave the bedroom. She couldn't. The pain in her ribs made walking feel like she was being stabbed with a rusty screwdriver. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fractured memories of the alley, trying not to think about Ben. Her brother had sold her out. That was the cold, hard truth she had to swallow with every dose of painkillers. He knew what Tommy was. He knew what would happen. And he left anyway. By the end of the first week, the swelling in her right eye finally went down. The dark purple bruises across her face began to fade into a sickly, mottled yellow. Dr. Evans removed the sling from her shoulder, warning her to keep her movement slow and deliberate. On the 8th day, Sadie couldn't stand the four walls of the bedroom anymore. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. The floorboards were warm, radiant heating. She stood up, bracing a hand against the wall to steady a sudden wave of dizziness. She was wearing a pair of soft, gray sweatpants and an oversized white t-shirt Dr. Evans had provided. She looked like a ghost, thin and pale, her dark hair a tangled mess around her shoulders. She opened the bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The Hale estate was massive, a sprawling mansion built of dark wood, stone, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over a dense, private forest. The architecture was modern, but cold. There were no family photos on the walls, no clutter, just expensive abstract art and oppressive silence. Sadie walked slowly, one hand hovering over her ribs. She navigated a wide, sweeping staircase, her bare feet making no sound on the thick carpet. As she reached the ground floor, the silence broke. She heard a voice. Low, authoritative, carrying a dangerous edge. It came from a set of double doors slightly ajar down the hall. Sadie knew she should turn back. Snooping around a mafia boss's house was a fast track to a shallow grave. But curiosity and a desperate need to understand the man keeping her in this gilded cage pushed her forward. She crept closer, pressing her back against the wall near the gap in the doors. It was a study. Heavy mahogany bookshelves lined the walls. In the center of the room, Roman was sitting behind a massive desk. He wasn't wearing a jacket today, just a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms corded with muscle and a scattering of faded, jagged scars. Standing in front of his desk were two men. One was Carter, the giant who had carried her from the alley. The other was a man Sadie didn't recognize. He was bleeding. A lot. Blood dripped from the stranger's nose, staining the front of his light blue shirt. He was trembling, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. "I didn't know the shipment was yours, Mr. Hale," the bleeding man stammered, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, Sullivan told me it was a free grab at the docks. I wouldn't have touched it if I knew it belonged to the syndicate." Roman didn't look angry. That was the terrifying part. He leaned back in his leather chair, holding a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes fixed on the man. "Ignorance is a very poor excuse for theft, Marcus," Roman said smoothly. "If you didn't know who owned the shipment, you lacked the intelligence required to operate in this city. If you did know, and you took it anyway, you lacked the respect. Please, I'll pay it back, with interest. Just give me a week." Roman set the glass down on a leather coaster. The soft thump echoed in the quiet room. "I don't need your money. I need Sullivan to understand that his reach has exceeded his grasp. And I need a messenger." Roman nodded slightly at Carter. Carter stepped forward. He grabbed the bleeding man's right hand, slamming it flat onto the heavy oak desk. The man let out a panicked shriek, trying to pull away, but Carter's grip was like an industrial vice. Roman opened a drawer. He pulled out a heavy steel cigar cutter. Sadie clamped a hand over her mouth, her stomach violently overturning. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch. "Tell Tommy," Roman's voice drifted out to the hallway, completely void of emotion. "The next time he sends a dog to steal from my table, I won't just clip its claws. I'll cut off its head." A sickening crunch, a wet, tearing sound, a scream that tore through the quiet mansion, echoing off the high ceilings. Sadie couldn't breathe. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her broken ribs so hard she thought they might snap again. She turned and fled back toward the stairs, moving as fast as her battered body would allow. She didn't stop until she was back in her room, the door shut firmly behind her. She collapsed onto the bed, shaking uncontrollably. "He's a monster," she thought, pulling her knees to her chest, just like she had in the alley. "He isn't a savior. He's just a bigger, deadlier predator." Hours passed. The house fell silent again. The screaming man was gone. Around 8 o'clock that evening, there was a soft knock on her door. Sadie flinched. "Come in," she said, her voice tight. The door opened. It wasn't Dr. Evans. It was Roman. He was holding a silver tray with a bowl of soup, some bread, and a glass of water. He walked in casually, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. "Dr. Evans had to leave for the evening," Roman said, not looking at her as he adjusted the silverware. "She said you needed to eat." Sadie stared at him. She looked at his hands. They were perfectly clean. No blood. No dirt. "I'm not hungry," she said tightly. Roman turned to face her. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in her rigid posture, the way she was shrinking back against the headboard. He was incredibly perceptive. It took him less than 3 seconds to calculate the equation. "You were downstairs this afternoon," he stated. It wasn't a question. Sadie swallowed hard. Lying to a man like him seemed futile. "Yes." Roman didn't apologize. He didn't offer an explanation. He walked slowly toward the bed, stopping a few feet away. "This is my world, Sadie," he said quietly. "It is violent, it is ugly, and it requires a certain language to maintain order. If you're going to wander the halls, you will see things that upset your delicate sensibilities." Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Sadie's chest. It burned through the fear, giving her a sudden, reckless burst of energy. "My delicate sensibilities?" she snapped, pushing herself up slightly, ignoring the flare of pain in her side. "I was beaten half to death in an alley because of a debt I didn't owe. I know exactly how ugly the world is. I just don't pretend I'm better than the thugs in the gutter while I'm breaking people's bones." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Roman went completely still. His dark eyes locked onto hers, cold and piercing. Most men would have backhanded her for speaking to him that way, but Roman just stared. He looked at the fierce defiance burning in her remaining good eye. He looked at the way her jaw was set, refusing to cower. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was barely a millimeter, but it was there. The faintest ghost of a smirk. "Eat your soup, Sadie," he murmured, turning toward the door. "You're going to need your strength." By the 3rd week, the physical pain had dulled to a persistent, manageable ache. The deep purple rings around Sadie's eyes had faded to a sickly yellow, and she could finally draw a full breath without feeling like a rusted blade was scraping against her lungs. She was healing. But the estate was suffocating her. It was a beautiful tomb. The sprawling mansion was always kept at a precise 68 degrees. The staff moved like ghosts, cleaning rooms she never used, leaving perfectly portioned meals on silver trays and never meeting her eyes. It was a masterclass in isolation. Sadie felt less like a guest and more like a piece of antique furniture Roman Hale was storing until he figured out what to do with it. She found him on a Tuesday evening. The rain had returned to Oak Haven. lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the West Wing. Sadie followed the low, rhythmic thrum of a cello playing from a high-end sound system. It led her to a massive private library she hadn't seen before. Roman was sitting in a winged leather chair by a roaring fireplace. He wasn't working. He was just staring into the flames, a glass of dark amber liquor resting on the armrest. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, stripping away the corporate armor of his usual three-piece suits. Without the sharp tailoring, he didn't look any less dangerous. He just looked like a predator resting between hunts. Sadie stood in the doorway. She was wearing her own clothes, jeans and a faded gray sweater the staff had washed and mended. "You're breathing quieter," Roman said. He didn't turn his head. He just watched the fire. "Your ribs are knitting together." "I want to leave." The words dropped heavily into the quiet room. Sadie gripped the doorframe, bracing herself for his reaction. Roman picked up his glass. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. He took a slow sip, then finally turned his head to look at her. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across his sharp jawline. "I told you the door is unlocked, Sadie. I don't keep hostages. You keep leverage. You said it yourself." She stepped into the room, her bare feet sinking into the thick Persian rug. "But I'm useless to you. Tommy Sullivan hasn't come looking for me. He thinks I'm dead. My brother is gone. I have nothing you want, and I am tired of living in a terrarium." Roman set the glass down. He stood up, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace, and walked over to a heavy oak desk near the window. He opened a drawer, pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, and dropped it onto the wood with a heavy thud. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice low. "A list of people you've ruined?" she fired back. Roman ignored the barb. "It's a ledger of debts. Some are financial, some are favors. In my world, everything has a price, and every price is eventually paid. When I pulled you out of that alley, I bought your brother's debt from Tommy's boss, $40,000. Sadie's stomach plummeted. The room suddenly felt entirely too warm. "I didn't ask you to do that. I didn't do it for you," Roman stated coldly. "I did it because it gave me a financial foothold to gut Sullivan's operations. But the fact remains, the debt is on my books, and Ben is nowhere to be found." "I don't have $40,000, Sadie said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I wait tables, Roman. I don't own a car. I don't have savings." Roman walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. He stopped just inches away. He was a full head taller than her, forcing Sadie to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze. Up close, she could see the faint, silvery scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "I know," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "Which is why you are going to work for me." Sadie barked out a harsh, cynical laugh. "Doing what? Breaking fingers? Shaking down corner stores? You have a sharp tongue, Sadie, but you also have an incredible capacity for observation." Roman reached out. For a second, Sadie thought he was going to grab her, but he just brushed a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His fingers were calloused, contrasting sharply with the gentle movement. "You noticed the shift changes of my security detail in 3 days. You figured out Carter is deaf in his right ear, which is why you only approach him from the left. You are observant, and you are invisible. People look at you and see a broken girl from the Narrows." Sadie swallowed hard. She hadn't realized he was watching her so closely. "I own a club downtown," Roman continued. his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic cadence. The Obsidian, high-end, exclusive. Men with a lot of money and a lot of secrets drink my liquor and talk too loudly. I need someone on the floor who knows how to listen. Someone who doesn't look like a threat. You want me to be a spy? I want you to be a hostess, Roman corrected smoothly. You will smile, you will seat politicians and cartel runners, and you will remember every name, every face, and every whispered conversation you hear. In exchange, I write off $1,000 of your brother's debt every week. You get a safe apartment in my territory, and Tommy Sullivan never touches you. It was a lifeline wrapped in barbed wire. If she said yes, she was officially stepping into the criminal underworld. If she said no, she walked out the front door and back into the crosshairs of a man who had already tried to kill her. Sadie looked into Roman's dark, unreadable eyes. She was terrified of him. But as she stood there, smelling the faint scent of cedar and expensive scotch radiating off him, she realized something even more terrifying. She trusted his brand of ruthlessness. It was logical. It had rules. I want my own bank account, Sadie negotiated, her voice hardening. I won't just work to pay off Ben's mistake. I want a salary on top of the debt reduction. If I'm risking my neck in your club, I want enough money to leave this city when the debt is clear. Roman's jaw tightened. A heavy, dangerous silence stretched between them. Then the corner of his mouth curved upward into a genuine, albeit dark, smile. Deal, he said. The Obsidian Club didn't have a sign. It didn't need one. It sat beneath a towering skyscraper in the financial district, hidden behind a set of unmarked, matte black steel doors. Sadie stood in front of the floor-to-length mirror in her new apartment, a sleek, modern loft Roman had provided, located precisely 3 blocks from the club. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The diner uniform was gone. In its place was a floor-length emerald green silk dress. It clung to her curves, the fabric cool and heavy. The high neckline concealed the fading yellow bruises on her collarbone, while the long sleeves hid the lingering marks on her arms. A professional makeup artist, sent by Roman earlier that afternoon, had expertly masked the remaining discoloration on her cheekbone, accentuating her sharp features and dark eyes. She looked expensive. She looked like she belonged to Roman Hale. There was a heavy knock on the door. Sadie grabbed a small black clutch and opened it. Carter stood in the hallway, looking like a granite statue in a tailored suit. "Cars downstairs," he grunted. The ride to the club was silent. Sadie stared out the tinted windows at the rain-slicked streets of Oakhaven. Her hands were trembling slightly. She clasped them tightly in her lap, forcing herself to breathe steadily. Carter bypassed the line of wealthy patrons waiting in the drizzle and escorted Sadie through a heavily guarded side entrance. The inside of the Obsidian was a masterclass in sensory manipulation. The lighting was low and moody, cast from fixtures that looked like glowing veins of gold running through the dark stone walls. The air smelled of expensive perfume, leather, and cigar smoke. A slow, bass-heavy jazz track pulsed through the floorboards. Roman was waiting for her near the main bar. He wore a midnight blue suit that looked black in the dim light. As Sadie approached, he turned. For a fraction of a second, his calculated, stoic expression faltered. His gaze swept over her, taking in the emerald silk, the dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. It wasn't a look of predatory hunger. It was a look of absolute, undeniable possession. "You look the part," he said, his voice a gravelly murmur that barely carried over the music. "I feel like a piece of bait," Sadie replied, keeping her chin high. "You are," Roman said plainly, offering his arm. "Tonight, Tommy Sullivan's lieutenant, a man named Russo, is sitting in VIP booth 3. Sullivan is bleeding cash, and Russo is looking for new supply lines. I want to know who he's meeting with. You will bring them their first round of drinks. You will pour slowly, and you will listen." Sadie hesitated, then slipped her hand into the crook of Roman's arm. His muscles were rock hard beneath the expensive wool of his suit. "What if he recognizes me?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Russo never saw you in the alley. To him, you are just a beautiful distraction." Roman leaned in close, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. A shiver racked down Sadie's spine that had nothing to do with fear. "And if anyone touches you, Carter will break their neck before they draw their next breath. You are safe here, Sadie." He pulled away, his eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his stare grounded her. Sadie nodded. She walked over to the bartender, picked up a silver tray carrying an $800 bottle of scotch and 3 crystal glasses, and made her way toward the VIP section. The floor was a maze of plush velvet booths and shadowed corners. Sadie moved smoothly, letting the heavy silk of her dress glide around her ankles. She approached booth 3. Russo was a thick-necked man with a cheap haircut and a suit that didn't fit right. He was sweating, despite the cool air conditioning. Sitting across from him were 2 men in sharp, European-cut suits. Cartel. Sadie pasted on a polite, hollow smile. She stepped up to the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. Compliments of Mr. Hale." Russo stopped talking immediately. He looked up, his eyes raking over Sadie's body with a crude, visceral hunger that made her skin crawl. He didn't recognize her face, but he certainly recognized the value of the dress she wore. "Tell Hale thanks," Russo grunted, leaning back. Sadie set the glasses down. She picked up the heavy crystal decanter and began to pour. She did it meticulously, keeping her eyes on the amber liquid, but her ears were entirely dialed into the heavy, tense silence of the men. As she finished pouring the 3rd glass, the cartel man closest to her leaned in toward Russo. He spoke in a rapid, hushed Spanish. Sadie's breath hitched. She had taken 3 years of Spanish in high school. She wasn't fluent, but she knew enough. "Tomorrow, midnight, the rail yards at the north end." "English, por favor," Russo spat nervously. "We're in America." "Tomorrow at midnight," the cartel man repeated with a heavy accent, his eyes darting to Sadie. "Have the cash ready, or we take the product to Hale." Sadie placed the bottle down. She gave a small, deferential nod and backed away from the table. Her pulse was roaring in her ears. She navigated back through the crowded club, heading straight for the private staircase that led to the Roman's office on the upper floor. She found him standing by a wall of security monitors, watching the club floor. "The rail yards," Sadie said breathlessly as she closed the heavy oak door behind her. "North End, tomorrow at midnight. Russo is buying a shipment to bail Tommy out." Roman slowly turned around. He looked at her, his eyes dark and calculating. He didn't praise her immediately. He simply absorbed the information, his mind already moving chess pieces across a board only he could see. "You did well," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. Sadie let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline rapidly leaving her system. She leaned back against the heavy wooden door, suddenly exhausted. The emerald dress felt 10 times heavier. Roman walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, invading her personal space. The scent of cedar and smoke wrapped around her. He reached out and gently traced the line of her jaw with the back of his knuckles. "You have a talent for this," he murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "But this life changes you, Sadie. Once you learn how to hunt, you can never go back to being a civilian." "I haven't been a civilian since you pulled me out of the garbage, Roman." She didn't flinch away from his touch. For the first time since they met, Sadie didn't feel like a captive. She felt like an accomplice. And the realization terrified her more than the men downstairs ever could. 3 weeks passed. The obsidian became Sadie's new reality. She learned the rhythms of the criminal elite. She learned how to spot a concealed weapon beneath a tailored jacket, how to read the panic in a gambler's eyes, and exactly how long to linger at a table to catch a whispered secret. Roman kept his word. Every Sunday, he showed her the ledger, $1,000 meticulously crossed out. Their dynamic had shifted. The icy, transactional distance of the estate had melted into something far more dangerous. They moved around each other with a tense gravitational pull. Late at night, after the club emptied, Roman would pour 2 glasses of scotch in his office. They would sit on the leather sofas, dissecting the night's intel. He treated her not as a subordinate, but as an equal mind. Sadie found herself looking for him in crowded rooms. She found herself noticing the way his jaw clenched when he was stressed, or the rare, genuine smirk that only appeared when she challenged him. She was falling for the monster, and she knew it. Then, on a rainy Thursday night, the fragile world they were building shattered. Sadie was in the upstairs office, tallying the night's receipts, when the heavy oak door banged open. Carter walked in. He wasn't moving with his usual slow, methodical pace. He looked urgent. Behind him, 2 lower-level enforcers were dragging a man by his arms. The man was battered. His lip was split. His clothes were soaked in rain and mud, and he was fighting wildly against the grips of the massive guards. "Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am?" the man screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Sadie's blood ran completely cold. The pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the mahogany desk. It was Ben. Her brother looked older, thinner, and utterly pathetic. He was dragged to the center of the Persian rug and forced to his knees. Roman stepped out from the shadows near the window. He had been standing there, perfectly still, smoking a cigarette. He crushed the ember into a heavy crystal ashtray and walked slowly toward the center of the room. "I know exactly who you are, Benjamin," Roman said, his voice dangerously soft. "You are a rat who ran a $40,000 tab on my territory and left your sister to pay the price in an alley." Ben's eyes darted frantically around the room, finally landing on the desk. He froze. "Sadie!" he choked out. Sadie stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away from her brother. A hurricane of emotions violently slammed into her, relief that he was alive, blinding rage that he had abandoned her, and a cold, creeping dread about what Roman was going to do. "You're alive," Ben stammered, fresh tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Oh my God, Sadie, I thought Tommy killed you. I thought you were dead." I almost was, Sadie said. Her voice sounded entirely devoid of emotion. It sounded like Roman's. Where have you been, Ben? Chicago. I had to lay low. But I came back. I came back to get you. I swear. He was caught trying to steal a car from the south lot, Carter rumbled from the doorway. Wasn't trying to find anyone. Was trying to get out of the city again. Ben's face crumpled. He looked up at Roman, groveling. Please, I'll get the money. Just let us go. You have her. Just let us walk away. Roman looked at Ben with the absolute disgust of a man stepping on a cockroach. He slowly reached behind his back, slipping a heavy, matte black pistol from the holster at his waist. He racked the slide. The metallic clack echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet room. Ben began to hyperventilate, begging, pleading, pressing his forehead against the rug. Roman held the gun by his side. He looked at Sadie. This is your brother, Roman said flatly. He sold you to men who broke your bones. He left you to rot. And now he is a liability. Roman stepped forward, offering the grip of the pistol to Sadie. He owes me $40,000, but he owes you a life. You make the call. Sadie stared at the heavy weapon in Roman's hand. The metal gleamed in the dim light. Roman, no, she whispered, her hands trembling. This is the world, Sadie, Roman pushed, his voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper that only she could hear over Ben's sobbing. There is no mercy for men like this. If I let him walk, he will gamble again. He will steal again. And eventually, he will lead Sullivan straight to you. You want to survive? You cut the rotting branches off the tree. He's my blood. He's a parasite. Roman pressed the cold grip of the gun against her palm. Take it. Sadie's fingers instinctively curled around the metal. It was heavy. So incredibly heavy. She looked down at Ben. She remembered the alley. She remembered the blinding agony of her ribs cracking, the freezing rain, the absolute certainty that she was going to die alone in the garbage. Ben had caused that. He had traded her life for a few extra hours at a poker table. She raised the gun. Her hands were shaking violently. She pointed the barrel at the floor, inches from Ben's head. Ben screamed, covering his face with his chained hands. Sadie, please! I'm your brother! Please! Sadie's finger hovered over the trigger. She looked into Roman's eyes. He was watching her intently, waiting to see if the innocent girl from the diner was truly dead, waiting to see if she had finally become a creature of his world. She held the gun there for 10 agonizing seconds. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Then, slowly, Sadie lowered the weapon. She flipped the safety on with her thumb and handed it back to Roman. No, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. Roman's jaw tightened. Sadie? I said no. She stepped closer to Roman, refusing to back down. I am not you, Roman. I am not going to execute a pathetic, broken man on a Persian rug to prove I belong in your world. She turned on her heel, looking down at her sobbing brother. Carter, Sadie commanded. It was the first time she had ever given an order in that building. Carter looked at Roman. Roman gave a microscopic nod. Yes, miss. Take him to the edge of the city limits. Put him on a bus going west. If he ever comes back to Oak Haven, you can shoot him yourself. Carter hoisted Ben up by the collar, ignoring his blubbering thanks, and dragged him out of the office. The heavy doors clicked shut. Sadie stood in the center of the room, her back to Roman. She was shaking, her adrenaline crashing hard. Roman walked up behind her. He didn't speak. He reached out, wrapping his strong, heavy arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. Sadie let her head fall back against his shoulder, letting out a fractured sob she had been holding in for months. She gripped his forearms, anchoring herself to the monster who had just forced her to stare into the abyss. "You're softer than I am," Roman murmured against her skin, his voice laced with a strange, dark reverence. "But you're just as ruthless." Sadie closed her eyes, the scent of cedar and gunpowder washing over her. She had spared her brother, but as Roman held her in the dark office, she realized the truth. Ben was gone, but she was exactly where she belonged. Peace is a fragile, temporary illusion in Oakhaven. It lasted exactly 2 months. In that time, Roman systematically dismantled Tommy Sullivan's empire. He didn't use bullets. He used ledgers, supply chains, and whispered threats in dark rooms. He choked the life out of Tommy's cash flow until the man was backed into a corner, desperate and bleeding respect. Desperation makes violent men remarkably stupid. It was a Friday night. The Obsidian was packed, a sweltering mass of expensive perfume, clinking crystal, and low, throbbing bass. Sadie was near the front, wearing a sleek, high-collared black dress that made her look like a shadow moving through the crowd. She was directing a state senator to a private booth when the air pressure in the room suddenly shifted. A heavy, unnatural thud echoed over the jazz music. The reinforced steel doors at the main entrance didn't just open, they buckled inward. Sadie turned just as the second battering ram strike blew the doors off their hinges. Rain and cold air violently sucked into the warm club, followed immediately by the deafening staccato crack of automatic gunfire. Screams erupted, the polished veneer of the elite shattered in a fraction of a second. Wealthy men in tailored suits dove to the floor, crawling over broken glass and spilled champagne, dragging their dates down with them. "Get down!" Carter's voice boomed from across the room. Sadie didn't freeze. The girl who had cowered in the alley was dead. She dropped low, her knees hitting the sticky, liquor-soaked floorboards, and scrambled behind the massive, solid oak structure of the main bar. Bullets tore through the shelves above her, raining down an avalanche of shattered glass and top-shelf liquor. The sharp fumes of gin and bourbon burned her nostrils. Through the chaos, heavy boots stomped across the entranceway. "Hail!" a voice roared. It was rough, ragged, and instantly familiar. Sadie's blood turned to ice. Tommy Sullivan. She pressed her back against the oak cabinets, her chest heaving. She peeked around the edge of the bar. Tommy was standing in the center of the room, flanked by 4 heavily armed men. He looked deranged. His suit was soaking wet, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He held a submachine gun, his finger trembling on the trigger. Carter was pinned down behind a marble pillar, exchanging precise, disciplined fire with 2 of Tommy's thugs. Bodies littered the floor, mostly security, a few unlucky patrons. "Roman!" Tommy screamed, firing a blind burst into the ceiling. The geometric chandelier exploded, plunging half the club into darkness. "Come out here and look me in the eye, you corporate prick." Then a low, mechanical whirring sound cut through the ringing in Sadie's ears. The private elevator at the back of the club was descending. Roman was coming down. Tommy saw the indicator light. A sickening yellow grin spread across his face. He signaled his men to aim at the elevator doors. It was an ambush. The second those doors opened, Roman would be cut to ribbons. Sadie looked around frantically. The bartender was curled in a fetal position a few feet away, sobbing. Beneath the cash register, partially hidden by a towel, was the heavy steel barrel of a pump-action shotgun. Roman had told her it was there on her first night, just in case the velvet ropes fail. She remembered the alley. She remembered the feeling of her ribs snapping beneath Tommy's boots. She remembered the cold, clinical way Roman had handed her a gun to shoot her brother, and the realization that she couldn't kill a defenseless man. But Tommy wasn't defenseless. He was a rabid dog about to tear the only stable thing in her life to pieces. Sadie reached out. Her fingers closed around the wooden grip of the shotgun. It was shockingly heavy. She pulled it onto her lap and pumped the slide. The heavy, metallic clack-clack was lost in the screaming and gunfire. The elevator hit the ground floor with a soft ding. The elevator doors began to part. Tommy raised his weapon, bracing for the recoil. Sadie stood up. She didn't hesitate. She didn't announce herself. She simply rose from behind the ruined bar, leveled the heavy shotgun at Tommy Sullivan's center of mass, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a vicious physical blow that slammed into her dislocated shoulder, sending a shockwave of white-hot pain down her spine. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was catastrophic. Tommy didn't even have time to register her presence. The buckshot caught him squarely in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into a table of overturned chairs. He hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and shattered wood, completely motionless. The club went dead silent, save for the whimpering of the patrons on the floor. Tommy's men froze, turning in shock toward the bar. They saw a woman in a black dress, her shoulder bruised, smoke curling from the barrel of the shotgun in her hands. In that microsecond of distraction, the elevator doors fully opened. Roman stepped out. He didn't carry a submachine gun. He carried a customized suppressed pistol. With terrifying clinical precision, he dropped two of Tommy's men before they even realized he was in the room. Carter stepped out from behind the pillar and put a bullet through the skull of the third. The fourth man dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, throwing his hands in the air. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the smell of cordite, blood, and spilled alcohol. Sadie stood frozen behind the bar. Her hands were locked onto the shotgun in a death grip. The adrenaline was draining from her system, leaving a cold, trembling void in its wake. She looked down at Tommy Sullivan's ruined body. She had killed a man. The realization didn't bring guilt. It brought a terrifying, hollow sense of finality. Roman walked across the destroyed club floor. His shoes crunched over broken glass. He stopped in front of the bar, looking at Sadie. His dark suit was immaculate. He reached out and gently pushed the barrel of the shotgun down until it rested on the counter. Then, he stepped around the bar. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she wasn't. He reached out, taking her trembling hands in his, carefully prying her fingers away from the weapon. He pulled her against his chest. "Breathe," he commanded softly, his lips pressed against her hair. Sadie buried her face in his shoulder. She didn't cry. The tears were burned away by the adrenaline. She just held on to him, anchoring herself to his steady, rhythmic heartbeat while the world around them smelled of slaughter. He was going to kill you, she whispered, her voice rough and entirely devoid of emotion. I know, Roman said. He pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped away a smear of soot and liquor from her cheek. His eyes, usually so cold and unreadable, were blazing with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. You didn't hesitate. He wasn't Ben, Sadie replied flatly. He was a disease. A dark, incredibly proud smile touched the corner of Roman's mouth. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. Carter, Roman called out, not taking his eyes off Sadie. Sir, call the cleaners, pay the precinct captain double his usual rate, and get the car. We are going home. Home. The word settled into Sadie's bones, heavy and permanent. It took 3 days to scrub the blood from the obsidian. During that time, Sadie didn't leave the estate. She slept in the sprawling guest room, but she didn't feel like a captive anymore. She felt like a soldier returning to barracks after a deployment. On the 4th night, Roman summoned her to his study. The fire was roaring, casting long shadows across the mahogany bookshelves. Roman was sitting behind his desk. He wasn't drinking. The heavy leather-bound ledger was sitting open in front of him. Sadie walked in, wearing the same gray sweatpants and oversized t-shirt she had worn during her recovery. She sat in the leather armchair opposite his desk, tucking her legs beneath her. Roman picked up a heavy silver fountain pen. He looked down at the page. Tommy Sullivan is dead. His territory has been absorbed. His men have either pledged loyalty or left the city, Roman stated, his voice calm and businesslike. Your brother is gone, and you saved my life in that club. He dragged the pen across the paper. A thick, black line crossed out the final number in the column. Roman closed the ledger. He pushed it across the smooth wood of the desk until it bumped against the edge near Sadie. The debt is cleared, Roman said, leaning back in his chair. $40,000, paid in full. You are free, Sadie. You can walk out the front door right now. I will give you enough money to start over anywhere in the country. You never have to see me or this city again. Sadie looked at the heavy leather book. It was the thing that had tethered her to this violent, terrifying world. It was the excuse she had used to stay when she knew she should run. She looked up at Roman. His face was entirely stoic. He was giving her a genuine exit. But beneath the cold corporate exterior, she saw the microscopic tension in his jaw. She saw the way his fingers gripped the armrests of his chair just a fraction too tightly. He didn't want her to leave. He just wouldn't beg her to stay. Sadie stood up. She picked up the heavy ledger. She didn't walk toward the door. She walked toward the fireplace. Roman watched her in silence. Sadie stood before the roaring flames. She opened the book, gripping the spine with both hands, and forcefully tore the pages out in one thick, satisfying rip. She tossed the heavy parchment into the fire. The paper curled, turned black, and erupted in bright orange flames. She tossed the leather binding in after it. She turned back to Roman. I don't want to start over, she said, her voice steady and clear. I don't want to go back to wiping down tables, pretending the world is fair. The world is a meat grinder, Roman. I just finally figured out how to hold the handle. Roman stood up slowly. He walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from her. The heat from the fireplace radiated against their sides. If you stay, he murmured, his voice a gravelly, dangerous whisper. "There is no going back. You are not a hostess anymore. You are mine. And I do not share power, but I will share this empire with you." Sadie tilted her chin up, meeting his intense, dark stare without flinching. "I didn't burn that book to be your employee, Roman," she replied, her eyes flashing with a fierce, undeniable fire. "I burned it because I'm your partner." Roman's control finally snapped. He reached out, his hand tangling in her dark hair, and pulled her flush against his chest. His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive, bruising, and desperate. A violent collision of two people who had survived the dark by becoming the monsters in it. Sadie wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with every ounce of the fierce, unyielding survival instinct that had kept her alive in the alley. The rain continued to batter the windows of the estate, but inside, the cold was finally gone. She was broken when she arrived, beaten and left in the gutter. But the city's most ruthless man hadn't just saved her. He had forged her in fire, and together they were going to burn the rest of the world down. The streets of Oakhaven are ruthless, but Sadie proved she isn't just a survivor. She's a queen in the making. From a broken girl in an alley to the partner of the city's most dangerous mafia boss, her journey shows that sometimes the only way to beat the monsters is to rule them. If this dark, gritty romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, dramatic storytelling. What was your favorite moment? Let us know in the comments below.